the Tajik Soviet Socialist Republic, one of the USSR's lesser-known member states, but by no means of lesser importance. The Soviet Union proved to the world that it's possible to build a powerful, sovereign industrial nation without the capitalist mode of production. Its trailblazing experimentation procured to us a bounty of knowledge pertaining to economic planning, agricultural collectivization, the struggle for national liberation, and many other areas of the Soviet experience. However, the focal points of study for scholars, both bourgeois and proletarian, typically remain confined to Russia and the Eastern Bloc. After all, that was where much of the 20th century socialist world's population and resources were located. Naturally, many of the period's accomplishments would be attached to those areas as well. But hidden throughout the vast deserts and towering mountain ranges of this Central Asian republic is a history seldom studied in the West. There are lessons seldom learned. And unfortunately, the story that materializes as the fog of unawareness clears is one of arduous struggle, loss, and violence. Let us do right by those Tajik constructors of socialism who lost their homeland in 1991 by learning their history and hearing the stories of people who actually lived in Soviet Tajikistan here on The Revolution Report.
Hey there, comrades. I'm on the road again. Right now I'm in the city of Bakhtar, which is in the Central Asian Republic of Tajikistan. It's also a former Soviet republic.
The predominant religion here is Islam, and the vast majority of people here are Tajiks, who form part of the Persian ethnic and language group, located also in neighboring Afghanistan and Iran. But Russian is mainly used for communicating between people of different nations. That's because back in the Soviet Union, Tajikistan was much more diverse. Uzbeks and Kyrgyz already comprised sizable minorities when the Tajik SSR was created in 1929. But throughout the following 30 years, tens of thousands of engineers, scientists, and other specialists from Russia arrived. They came to help the Tajik people build socialism, to industrialize their motherland, and introduce cutting-edge technology to agriculture that was to be organized under collective ownership. By 1959, other Soviet nations comprised nearly half of the entire population, and they lived harmoniously with one another, as well as with the native Tajiks, a true success story of the USSR's friendship between peoples policy. From this victory of international cooperation, significant economic benefits began to emerge. Tajikistan became the new home of hundreds of factories and enterprises formerly located in Eastern Europe that were packed up and moved farther east in the wake of the Nazis' invasion of the Soviet Union in World War II. The decades after saw significant development in a variety of industries, the main ones being metalworking, fertilizer production, chemical production, hydroelectrical energy, textiles, and especially cotton production. In the 1970s, the country was producing nearly 5 billion kilowatt hours of energy a year, whereas before industrialization, they produced virtually none. Soviet Tajikistan was extracting 3 times as much coal and 9 times as much oil as it was before the Soviet period. In fact, before Soviet times, the country had forever been exclusively agrarian. Despite being the poorest republic in the Soviet Union, these titanic achievements brought Soviet Tajiks a significantly higher standard of living in comparison to Tajiks living in Afghanistan, China, Pakistan, or Iran. The days of living in barracks and tight-spaced communal homes had come to an end, as the mass availability of new apartments saw more and more families upgrade their living quarters. Like everywhere else in the Soviet Union, education was free, healthcare was free, and women had the same opportunities as men in social, economic, and political life. It's no wonder a massive 96% of Tajikistan voted yes in the 1991 referendum on whether or not to preserve the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, the will of the overwhelming union-wide majority was disregarded, and the USSR was dissolved by self-serving liberal politicians. If you watched our video on perestroika, you know what came next. Poverty, anarchy, and wars. But out of all of the conflicts that followed socialism's overthrow, Tajikistan's civil war was arguably the bloodiest and most destructive. From 1992 to 1997, chaos and violence cursed Tajik lands like a plague. Formerly repressed Islamic fundamentalists with ties to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan formed an alliance with the Tajik liberals and nationalists called the United Tajik Opposition. Together they attempted to overthrow Tajikistan's post-Soviet government, which mainly had the support of communists, secular-minded people, and people from ethnic minority groups who opposed Tajik nationalism. Unity descended into factionalism, order decayed into lawlessness. Armed warlords roamed the country, killing and maiming people, sometimes for political reasons, other times simply for personal gain. Neither combatants nor civilians were safe from the carnage. I traveled along the path of war from Stalingrad to Berlin. I saw blood and death. I saw the fascist beasts, but I never thought I would encounter similar cruelty here, in my Tajik homeland. I could never have imagined that the same people who peacefully lived alongside each other one day would kill each other the next day. It is a great shame for my people. This used to be the bathhouse of a state-owned farm. Islamic fundamentalists tortured hundreds of people who weren't guilty of anything. They tortured them here with fire. They castrated the men, took people's eyes out. They raped young girls. They cut off their breasts and then killed them. They offered mercy to neither the elderly nor the young. In these rooms of the bathhouse, they created torture chambers. I think even the fascists did not do such things. And to cloak their inhumanity, they claimed they were purifying the lands of infidels. Their leaders proclaimed, "Let there remain only 1 million Tajiks out of the current 3 million, as long as they will be true Muslims. The rest must be exterminated." The Islamic fundamentalists carried out a true genocide against their own people. In the end, most of what was built in the USSR was destroyed, with the economic damage estimated to be greater than $10 billion worth. Up to 100,000 people were killed, and 10 to 20% of the population was displaced, as many members of ethnic minority groups fled the country. Most notable were the Russians, essentially all of whom left by the time the Civil War was over. The state was so severely incapacitated by the Civil War's traumatic events that the Russian military even had to protect the country's borders until 2005, amid the absence of a competent domestic fighting force and the threats of the Taliban in Afghanistan. So over 2 decades later, what is Tajikistan like now, after all the destruction wrought by the Soviet Union's collapse? Well, Tajikistan's economy remains in the shadow of its former glory. Instead of exporting cotton and industrial products, the country's so-called comparatively advantageous commodity is the export of cheap labor, facilitated by the state. Between 1 and 2 million people out of the 9 million strong Tajik population work abroad in what is known as a remittance economy, meaning overseas workers send money home to sustain their families. About half of Tajikistan's GDP is comprised of remittances, making it the most remittance-reliant country in the world. For that reason, to the degree that xenophobia exists in Russia, it's mainly directed towards Tajiks, who often struggle with stereotypes comparable to those associated with Mexicans in the United States. But cheap labor is not the country's only big export. There's also the opium trade. Of course, the government doesn't officially participate in it, but given the country's widespread corruption, many officials likely benefit from it in one way or another. After all, 1/3 of Afghanistan's entire opium export is transported through Tajikistan. The status of women in society also significantly declined after socialism's overthrow, as the number of forced marriages exploded across the country, a practice that was fiercely repressed in the Soviet Union. Education is no longer completely free, nor is medical care, and naturally, all this has been accompanied by a colossal drop in the standard of living since the fall of the USSR. But don't take my word for it. I was able to get the perspectives of a couple of locals on life in Soviet Tajikistan while I was in Bakhtar. This first interview began after I simply asked about his life in the USSR. I wasn't exactly planning to record our conversation. However, after he told me that Vladimir Lenin is looking down at us from heaven, I knew he was going to have some interesting things to say.
А вот сейчас молодые, сегодня вечером я ее видел, пьяный, да, он 200 грамм выпил. Послезавтра я увижу, опять еще у него доза есть. Как китайские стали, да?
Да, да.
Сила нет у них.
Да. А советское образование было хорошим?
Конечно, советское образование это самый лучший был. Вот я учитель. Я учитель был на МНО. МНО это до 3 класса. Я педучилище закончил. Ну, раньше был такой, чтобы там дядя не надо был, деньги не надо был, тебя оттуда направление дали, чтобы вот на такой школе ты поедешь, учителем работаешь на своей профессии. А сейчас откуда? Сейчас все за деньги. Ты хочешь, ты деньги, скинь деньги, тебя начальник милиции поставит и скажет 2 года ты начальник милиции.
Ужас, конечно.
А если такое слово меня знают, они сразу на террорист, экстремист забирают.
This next guy I ran into on the street while I was filming background footage for this video. He talks a bit of smack about the government there, and I don't know if that can get him in trouble or not, so just to be safe, I decided to blur his face and protect his identity.
Киргизу из турма взяли, поставили.
Да?
Прикинь, туремчик из турма взяли народ. Его поставили на министра обороны. Бандит. Когда бандит министра обороны, его всегда может покупать на деньги. Один дипломат дают, он отравит людей.
Как Таджикистан был в Советском Союзе?
И лучше я что говорю. Один человек работали, 10 человек ушел за зарплату. Сейчас никаких зарплат нет. Мы вот поедем в Москву, работаем 6, 7 или год, но там приходим здесь, 5 месяцев только гуляем вот так. Никакой у нас нет работа или деньги, или зарплата.
Или это в советское время не надо было поехать?
Конечно, Советский Союз никто...
Зарплаты одинаковые.
Всех заводов, всех был.
Да.
Москва, хлеб 1 копейк был, Таджикистан тоже 1 копейк был. Чтобы бизнес на другое место по-другому цена такой не было. Сейчас вот здесь один товар, цены сейчас посмотрим. Еще один район поедешь, он уже подорого. Еще деревни поедешь, еще 10 сомони каждому, вот так. А во время Союза Москва хлеб был 1 копейк, масло, что все цены. Сюда приехал, сами конца деревни поедете, там на магазин такой цены, как в Москве. Цена одинаковая.
Цены одинаковые были.
Да.
А кем вы работали в Советском Союзе?
Я никем, потому что я с время Союза, я молодой был, я учил в школу. Когда я закончил 11, уже распал Союз. В то время, чтобы я кем-нибудь, где-нибудь работал. А у меня папа был прораб, строитель работал. Один папа, у нас семья был 8 человек. Мы вот так кушали, одевали, школу, всех. Даже хватит зарплата.
А потом гражданская война началась,
да? Вот у нас плохой после 92-й Америка, это руку всех быстро нас поймали, война друг к другу, гражданская война. Самый плохой это гражданство.
А сколько лет это было?
3 или 4, 97, да, 97 они уже окончилась война. Уже мир, суд, вот так друг другу помощь. Закончили войну. До этого 3-4 года всех заводов, фабрики, короче, продал, украл машину. Что было государство, всех покупали, украли, кто боевики, кто это, кто государство. Вот только у нас потихоньку, вот наш президент сейчас чистоту, порядку, это, так. До этого на время войны у нас что был завод, всех заводов был, стиль был завод, другие. Сейчас никто, никакой не работает. Оттуда они сначала сжег, поджигали заводы и украли оттуда все инструменты.
Да.
Вот. За это сейчас нигде работа нет.
Наш социализм был
Я что, конечно, всех любит во время Союза. Кто Союз увидел, я чуть-чуть увидел, мне понравился. За 1 рубль тебе столов, что хочешь кушай. Сейчас вот кто как хочет свои цены поставить на свои. Так нельзя.
Comrades, thanks for checking out our video. We hope you learned something new, and if you did, please make sure to like the video, share the video, and please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We need your support now more than ever, with channels like this one being shadow banned and overtly banned all around the Western world. As always, we'd like to give a shout out to our loyal comrades on Patreon. First, we have our rank and file revolutionaries, Fyodor, Jesse Toma Alkuri, Michael Iverson, Tara Mackin, Edward, Daniel Hemphill, Eric, and Irf. We don't have any commissars, but we do have general secretaries. A big thank you to Slava and Dylan Oris for supporting the channel. Okay, so thanks again to all of our supporters. We'll see you in the next video, and workers of the world unite.